Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about some of my master's research on urban forest restoration, and you're going to have to bear with me a little bit because I'm losing my voice. So, as Bruce said, in New Zealand a huge amount of our native forest cover has been lost. So these 4 stars show the cities where my research plots are located, and they're right in the middle of this red zone where there's less than 10% indigenous vegetation cover left. And here in Hamilton we have less than 2% indigenous vegetation cover. So the only way we can try and reverse this trend is through ecological restoration. And this is defined as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged or destroyed. And in New Zealand it's typically been focused on more remote areas, but as we've heard today, there's increasing recognition that cities also provide all of these unique opportunities for restoration. And these photos down the bottom here show one of our research sites in suburban Napier that's been restored by one person in a paddock next to their house. So this is it in 1981, and this is it last summer when we went to do a vegetation survey. And because the majority of New Zealand's population live in cities, restoring urban forests provide all sorts of different benefits. So they provide habitat for native wildlife, all sorts of important ecosystem services, improved health and well-being, an educational resource and green space for recreation, and they encourage nature advocacy by reconnecting people with nature right on their doorstep. One key problem though is that there's still a lot we don't know about what the most efficient way to restore an urban forest is. So we're pretty good at getting the initial canopy established, but for long-term success we need forests to self-regenerate over time. And this is a problem that I'm addressing in my research. So to help us understand the best way to build a self-sustaining forest in the city, we're investigating how regeneration dynamics of restored plantings vary with microclimate and vegetation composition among different New Zealand cities. So we want to understand what kind of factors constrain or promote the regeneration of native seedlings in the understory. And to do this, we're studying 36 different restoration plantings of various ages in 4 cities. So we've got Hamilton, Tauranga, New Plymouth and Napier. And all of these plots are in native forest patches that have been planted completely from scratch. And we have another master's student that's doing the same in these other 5 cities, which allows us to capture the full latitudinal range of climate in New Zealand. And we're measuring a bunch of different variables. So last summer we did a vegetation survey and we identified and measured the basal area of all the trees in our plots. So basal area is the amount of area taken up by tree stems measured in metres squared per hectare. So if you look at this little very basic diagram and imagine that you're looking at the plot from a bird's eye view and you've cut all the trees at 1.35 metres. Adding up the area of those little brown circles or tree stems will give you the basal area. And we also measured and identified and counted tree seedlings and saplings. We visually estimated herbaceous ground cover. We measured canopy openness, and we put out data loggers that over the past 12 months have measured relative humidity, air temperature and soil temperature. And this study is based on previous research that has found as forests age and the trees increase in size, the trees begin to form a closed canopy and this shades out herbaceous weed cover. And also stabilises the understory microclimate. And this is really important because herbaceous weed cover can limit seedling establishment and survival. And if the temperature is fluctuating and getting too hot or too cold, this can also cause seedling mortality. So once we get to this point in the forest development, we see an increase in seedling regeneration. And if we look at my results, we can see some of these processes occurring. So first of all, we have this plot showing basal area on the y-axis, which is the amount of area taken up by tree stems, as I said before, measured in metres squared per hectare. And planting age on the x-axis from 6 to 47 years. So this is the amount of time since the forest was first planted. And each of these little points shows an individual restored forest patch. So if you follow the dark line, which is the linear model, you can see that, as you would expect, as the forest ages, trees increase in size. And then on the second one we have percent canopy openness. So it follows the opposite trend, decreasing as the plantings age and trees begin to form this closed canopy, blocking out light and stabilising environmental conditions. And as the trees grow and canopy openness decreases, we can see on this third plot that herbaceous ground cover also tends to decrease because of this reduced light availability. And finally, you can see that native tree regeneration density, which we measured here as seedling stems per hectare, generally increases with planting age as trees grow and the canopy openness and herbaceous ground weed cover decrease. But there is this one outlier, which is shown in red up here. So it's a plot at Waiwhakariki that we're going to be visiting later today. And I think it has way more regeneration occurring than even some of these much older plots, which is really interesting. And I think this is a testament to the amount of knowledge and careful planning that's gone into this particular project. So based on these results, we can make a few recommendations. So designing plantings to encourage rapid canopy closure and get these regeneration processes started. And this could include things like planting fast-growing native trees, undertaking enrichment planting to get some later successional species in there, and planting relatively densely. So we recommend this 1-in-1 rule, which is using plants that are about 1 metre tall to maximise their chances of survival, and planting 1 plant per metre squared. And I think these 2 photos from 2 of our Napier sites do a good job of illustrating the effect that different planting densities have. So this one on the left here that was planted, they were planted only a year apart, but this one on the left here that was planted really densely to begin with already has a closed canopy with hardly any light making it through to the understory. And you can't really see any weeds there. So this will hopefully fast track its development to the self-sustaining forest. And this other site isn't wrong, it's just going to take a little bit longer to get to the point we want it to be because the trees were planted quite sparsely. And so because there's no closed canopy yet, we might have to budget for a bit longer to keep this grass under control. And this kind of observation that plantings are often designed very differently leads us on to the second part of my research. So the environmental conditions of a site aren't the only important factor. Ecological restoration also requires practitioners to make value-laden choices about what kind of goals, references and methods they're going to use in a particular area. And how these decisions are navigated is also going to influence the trajectory of plantings. So I want to understand a bit more about how practitioners make decisions when planning and managing their restoration projects, and why there might sometimes be this gap between what we know about best practice restoration and what's actually getting implemented. So to do this, I designed an online survey and we invited people involved with urban forest restoration to fill it out. Some of you might have filled it out yourselves. So we got 65 responses from people working across 10 cities, and 23 were professionals, so restoration was part of their job. And 42 were volunteers, so they were part of a community group or undertaking restoration on their own land. And we asked a bunch of different questions, so there were 18 in total, but I just want to focus on 2 of them here. What are the objectives of restoration, and is any kind of monitoring being undertaken to measure progress towards them? So ideally, the Society of Ecological Restoration recommends that projects include a formal restoration plan with clearly defined objectives and success criteria or monitoring protocol that can be used to evaluate the project. So when we asked practitioners what the restoration project objectives were, most of the responses we were given were pretty broad and focused on revegetation. So for example, one person said to get as much as practical of our designated environmental reserves back into native vegetation. And they also usually included social as well as ecological aspects. So for example, to provide the public with a natural habitat for them to appreciate and enjoy. And other things that were common were statements about eliminating exotic weeds, providing habitat for native wildlife, and providing green space benefits for people. And all of these are really, really great goals, but we did notice that only a handful of practitioners mentioned anything about restoring ecological processes or ecosystem function. And when we asked practitioners if they undertook any post-restoration monitoring, 58% said yes. And we can add to that the 7% that said monitoring was undertaken by an external organisation like Kiwi2 or a council, and those that said monitoring was done on some of their projects, and we have 69% that said some kind of monitoring was happening. But when we asked them to describe what they're doing, it was typically mostly informal observational monitoring of the site. So for example, simple looking at the site afterwards, checking to see if plants had survived, or just visual observations of change. So it ended up that just 7% of the practitioners were doing more formal monitoring, like vegetation plots, and measuring these things like regeneration that we just mentioned are really important for long-term sustainability. We also asked participants if they weren't doing any monitoring, why was this? And they said things like, formal monitoring is costly and for this work not really needed. We're going for gross change that's highly visible. Can't see the point in doing it, and it's not as important as getting the right plants in the ground. And generally most answers either described this lack of resources, a view that monitoring was unnecessary or unimportant, or just that other work was more of a priority. So this is just 2 questions, but when we look at the survey results as a whole, we can see a lot of answers reflect this kind of focus on revegetation rather than ecosystem restoration. And this can help explain some of this gap between what we consider best practice and what's actually getting done. So if you're focused on revegetation, then it makes sense that visual change is what you'd be monitoring. But because we want functional regenerating urban forests that provide the maximum biodiversity benefits where space for biodiversity is already so limited in these cities, just getting the plants in the ground doesn't always guarantee that all the other pieces of the puzzle are going to fall into place. And we also see that limited resources restrict what's possible for practitioners. So as it's already been mentioned, there's often not enough money or time or manpower to get everything done. So getting plants in the ground and keeping weeds under control are the priorities. And we can see that on the behalf of us or scientists in general, there's a failure to communicate the importance of outcome monitoring or pass along some of these best practice methods. So it's often assumed that published research will trickle down to practitioners, but this isn't always the case. And only 26% of the volunteer practitioners we surveyed used scientific publications to plan their plantings. So this means for the rest it can look something like this. And well, but not all of this knowledge is getting lost. So we also asked practitioners what other resources they use to help them plan their plantings, and 73% said they use discussions with plant or ecology experts. So this suggests that maybe prioritising these kind of interactions is something we could focus on. So to move from revegetation to restoration, there's a few things we could do better. And I think this is the theme of today. We already have a bunch of really great collaboration happening, but we could use more collaborative partnerships and knowledge sharing between scientists and practitioners. And it's really important that this is not just a one-way but two-way discussion, because researchers have a lot to gain from listening to practitioners. They have like this local ecological knowledge and experiential knowledge that's specific to their project that we lack. And they also know best what kind of information they need to help navigate decisions. And in terms of projects run by volunteers, we could use more capacity building and support where resources are limiting what's possible. So some of the things that Monica mentioned, like providing monitoring training, or just maybe some other organisations taking on some of the responsibility for monitoring in exchange for the awesome work these groups are doing. And in a lot of cases this is already happening. So to sum up, what we know so far is that before the canopy closes, regeneration is constrained by herbaceous weed cover and temperature fluctuations. And we can use this knowledge to help design forests to achieve rapid canopy closure and get these regeneration processes started. And finally, to ensure that this knowledge is put to use, we need to engage and collaborate with people using the practitioners and the end users. And here are some photos of people, cities and nature putting that to practice. Thank you.